Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about spoken word recordings today. You know, it's an interesting thing in the field of sound recording that when the phonograph was invented, you know, one of the tenets that Edison pushed very hard was recording the voices of our Gladstones, our great leaders, our presidents, whatever. He talked about that, and it meant a lot to him, you know, in a sense, that the phonograph would become something along those lines. It's interesting, if you have never seen the prophecies that Edison made about the phonograph, it's really quite interesting to read. He came up with 10 things, which in another video I'll talk about. But let's talk about spoken word on record. Now, of course, the thing is that in the earliest days of recorded sound recording was looked upon as a miracle. It was a simple thing. And you really didn't have a vast array of spoken word recordings. There would be some entertainment pieces, things like that, but you didn't have, in the 1880s, 1890s, for public consumption, recordings of our Gladstones, our presidents, our actors, etc., as Edison had prophesied. It wasn't until we get into the 20th century that we really start to promote the recording of prominent speakers. Yes, there were a few made in the 19th century. Most were made privately. There wasn't much made. And the interesting thing was, if there were speeches made, there was a series of individuals who would always do the part of the speaker, and it would never be the speaker themselves. There were countless recordings made in 1896 where they had supposedly William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan making speeches. These were done by Edison, these were done by Columbia, these were also done by smaller phonograph concerns, the ones that were still around. They were vanishing rapidly. Sadly, these were not those individuals. These were studio recordings that were made. Interesting thing to think of, you know, for those of us who understand acoustic recording, and as I've said before, you do this, it kind of gives you what the voice sounds like, and the limited range of how far you could record, you couldn't make a recording acoustically outside when one of these politicians were speaking. And also, if you get the audience cheering, it'll be a very distant cheer. That is why when you listen to these recordings, and I have been told by countless people, these are the original recordings. These were done by the person themselves. Well, the problem I have with it is they give a speech, and collectively at one spot there's a big yay! It's so well done. It starts and stops at the same time. That's pure studio. People don't realize this because, well, they don't realize what it was like in those days. When a politician gave a speech, there would be all kinds of sounds in the background. Of course, with acoustic recording, that couldn't be picked up. And so when we had, with the United States, our presidents making recordings, the earliest president to make a recording was Benjamin Harrison. He made a recording for Bettini. But it's pretty doubtful McKinley made a recording. It's totally doubtful that Cleveland made a recording. It's totally doubtful that William Jennings Bryan made a recording in 1896. He would make a lot of recordings many years later. Also in the election of 1900, same things, but you didn't really have any big recordings coming out of that. Actually, when it came to spoken word with the American presidency, it wasn't until 1908 that actually there were commercial releases on Edison, on Victor, on Columbia of the candidates. It was the first time. Didn't happen before. And so I'm really sorry to say to people who think they're hearing recordings of these people, I seriously doubt that they are. Spoken word really got off at the beginning of the 20th century. Columbia did it, Victor did it, Edison did it. They got great speakers of the time. Even Berliner did it. A lot of great speakers made Berliner disc recordings. They're very hard to understand. Chauncey Depew, the great after-dinner speaker, made a couple of Berliners. Joseph Jefferson, the noted actor, made a bunch of recordings. Buffalo Bill made a recording, and a number of others did as well. Victor recorded lots of people, and starting in 1908, recorded all the presidential candidates. The Monarchs eventually in the UK eventually started making recordings later, but there's nothing that we can really say that's Queen Victoria, although there are private recordings that were made. I don't know if there's a recording of Edward. I've never heard of one existent. Gladstone's voice, of course, is preserved in those recordings made at Little Menlo for Edison in London. And there's a number of those recordings. Unfortunately, copies were made of them, and there are existent copies in various parts of the world and in various archives. In fact, I think if I recall correctly, that batch of cylinders was found next to Edison's bed in his office, I think in the 1950s or somewhere right around there. So spoken word is an important thing because spoken word captures the essence of the individual. We don't have recordings of Lincoln. We don't have recordings of great speakers. What would we think of these individuals if we could hear them? It's a very interesting thing, especially with Abraham Lincoln. He had a very unique voice, and it was known to be rather high and somewhat squeaky, with a Kentucky accent, and if you think about it, sometimes you need a translator with people like that. And people used to comment on it was hard to understand him at times, and that when he would get real excited, he would kind of almost shriek. Now, this would not have gone over well with a listening crowd of today, of course, but it would have been interesting to hear the way he spoke. We don't have anybody from that time, of course. It's interesting, there's recordings of other speakers. Some of the speakers we wish we had, like Mark Twain, nothing. We have no idea exactly what he sounded like. There is a radio or a recording piece by the actor William Gillette, who talked about how Twain spoke, and I find it quite a bit different than how Hal Holbrook did it, but it's interesting to note. I remember reading when I was a kid and didn't know that Twain had not made records, that Holbrook learned to speak like Twain by listening to recordings of his voice. Well, in the 1960s, that was an easy thing to do because nobody knew anything about recording, because there was very little information out. It was all kind of hidden and hadn't been discovered, or no one really cared. And for the folks in the 50s and 60s that were starting groundbreaking stuff, they had to contend with the fact that perhaps there were recordings, because we didn't know. Now, of course, we do know that the voice of Mark Twain was stilled in 1910 and will never be heard again. There were great poets, great actors, great performers, great politicians, all captured on sound recording. And many of them we can hear, and many we can marvel at, and many we can sit there and say, my God, what an interesting or frightening voice it may be. A lot of people are rather shocked when they listen to Theodore Roosevelt speak. When they think of the Rough Rider, their mental image is something so very, very different from the voice that you hear. Woodrow Wilson sounds like a teacher. He was a teacher. William Howard Taft often sounds like a judge. He was. And Warren G. Harding sounds like an everyday guy who was a newspaper publisher. Actually, I like his speeches. I find it interesting to listen to. It's kind of like plain speak, but a lot of people, the snobbish ones, didn't like him at all. Calvin Coolidge, interesting voice. It's interesting if you do get to listen to the Berliner recording of Chauncey Depew. He sounds very much like the people who spoke at that time. Listen to Joseph Jefferson. He sounds very similar to Chauncey Depew. It was a style of speaking. Our styles have changed. Harry Humphreys, he did so many recordings of Lincoln, and he did speeches of McKinley and other people. He also did that famous recording for Edison that scared the hell out of a lot of people called Santa Claus Hides in Your Phonograph. And man, it was the Santa Claus from hell. My God. Hello, boys and girls. You know, that's really scary. I mean, that's not exactly the sound you expect to hear. But if you ever get a chance, listen to that too. So spoken word has been a wonderful thing because it creates an archive of a human essence. And I think that's important because, as I said with Lincoln, I can read Lincoln, but I can't truly understand him because I can't hear him. I can't hear how he says something. And that tells you an awful lot about how someone feels about things, or the emphasis they put on certain words because they mean so much. Just interesting thoughts to ponder on the wonders of sound recording and the wonders of listening to a politician speak. One last thing I want to mention before I end this. I made recordings of President Gerald Ford in 1999. And in my conversations with President Ford, we were talking about various politicians and how they spoke and how recording really started, in the 20th century. And I played a recording of Theodore Roosevelt speaking. And it was interesting because there were certain aspects of this recording that were fascinating, and this whole event that were fascinating. I had the 26th president speaking to the 38th president. That was pretty amazing when you think about it. And Ford listened to the speech, and he said, a highly unusual voice. He said, but you could do that speech today. Politics hasn't changed too much. The matter of speaking has, because everything changed with speaking once television came out. I mean, John F. Kennedy changed everything. He became more or less the template of what we're all trying to do on television.